So the average Christian would say, it's been 25 years, it just slipped. Nobody's perfect, those things happen. You know what I said? What's going on in my brain? What caused that to happen? What thoughts are not captive? What thoughts are not obedient? How? God help me. What did Jesus say? How can bad water and good water come out of the same spring? Or the same well? How can words of profanity and praise come out of the same heart? God help us! Do we see it that way? Do we take it that seriously? What am I listening to? What am I watching? What am I taking in? What am I allowing to have happen that caused that? Those are serious questions. And so, friends, we see that the meaning of the incarnation is huge, because if Christ would not have come, there'd be no clear knowledge of God. We wouldn't see the clarity of Christ that gives clarity to who and what Christ is. All we would have is that Old Testament revelation, because there'd be no New Testament revelation. You see, after those 400 years of silence, there were the expectations of the Messiah. But there were also misconceptions about who and what the Messiah would be. Listen to me. After all that God had done in communicating himself to his people through the Old Testament, after 400 years of science, Jesus comes on the scene, and the most of his followers miss him. Why? They had a total misunderstanding of who and what Messiah was to be. Tell me, dear ones, if rather than 400 years of silence, there were 400 years of silence and then 2,000 more years of whatever, where would our understanding of the Messiah be today if Christ would never have come? If there were well-meaning religious Jewish people who loved God and served God, who totally missed him 2,000 years ago, what would be the chances of us seeing Messiah today if Jesus had never come? Are you thankful that you're not living in that darkness? Are you thankful that you didn't live during those 400 years of silence? No appearance of Christ, no incarnation, no shepherd, no ministry of Jesus. Where in the world would we be? How about the confusion of the world? You see, friends, there are still areas where the true God is not yet known on our globe today. And from history and literature, we know what the false gods are like. The false gods that have been taught by false religions and still are being taught today. We know what they're like. We see them today. These are gods that have been invented by men to satisfy their religious desires. The gods of the Greeks and the gods of the Romans, we know from Old Testament and ancient history and New Testament times, were cruel and revengeful. They quarreled among themselves. They tried to defeat each other's plans. They had to be appeased with wicked offerings, and they were often untruthful and unfaithful. We here today are sometimes shocked at how Americans could fall prey for the false gods of our day. But where would they be and where would we be if we had not Christ? You see, only with the coming Jesus was the true nature of the Father revealed as loving and as caring and doing everything possible to reconcile rebellious humankind back to himself. And so we have to understand that absolutely there would be no clear knowledge of God. But secondly, there would have been no New Testament at all. Think about this. Think about how much preaching and teaching we hear out of the New Testament. Think about how much the Christian church today focuses on the New Testament. Why? Is the Old Testament somehow insufficient? No, but the New clarifies and expands and advances the Old. What if it didn't exist? You have heard it asked before, is there a difference between the words in Malachi chapter 4, verse 6 that say, "Lest I come and smite the earth with a curse." That's how it ends. If it had not been for the coming of Jesus and the incarnation, where would we be? Would we still be sacrificing lambs, bulls, and goats, whose blood could never take away sin? For only Jesus himself could offer the perfect sacrifice that can make an enduring atonement. Do you know how many people of God's people Israel have turned from the faith because, listen, Messiah has never come. They're tired of waiting for Messiah. In their mind, Messiah has never come. Where would we be? Most of us come from Greek backgrounds. We may never even have looked for Messiah in the first place. Living under the influence of rebellious leaders and continuous pressure, as the Jewish people were, to create new laws and new rules to appease the Lord and to guide our life apart from Messiah, the Jewish people were going astray. Let me ask you this, as authentic as the Jewish people were in trying to serve God, how effective were they at reaching Gentiles for the cause of Christ before Jesus? What are the chances that any of them would have lived in such a way to win us to the Lord? Facing the tendency of forgetting the requirements of our God or the law of God, as many Jews do today. You know, I'll never forget the time I was sitting in an Orthodox Jewish synagogue in Brooklyn, New York, and one of our brothers that was on our team asked the rabbi, "How do you get around blood atonement? You are commanded to make sacrifices for the atonement of sin. You don't do it anymore. How do you get around that?" And he said, "Well, our rabbis and our scholars teach today that reading about it is as good as doing it." How far does that go? Now, obviously, dear friends, if these things were true, by extrapolation, we would not have the Sermon on the Mount with all of the Beatitudes. We wouldn't have the parables. We'd know nothing of the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son. We would not have the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians to tell us what love is. We wouldn't have Ephesians telling wives how to love their husbands or husbands their wives. We wouldn't have any of that. We wouldn't have Paul's marvelous descriptions of the plan of salvation. We would not have the description of heaven in the book of Revelation. We would have none of that. Think of how shocking the teaching of Jesus was to the religious people of that day. Do you remember how shocking the teachings of Jesus were? He astounded them. He shocked them. He offended them. Think of how meaningless the Jewish faith was to much of the pagan world of that day. Think about what it would be today. Dr. D. James Kennedy, before he died, wrote a book that really expands on what I've just touched on this morning when he wrote a book entitled, "What If Jesus Had Never Been Born?" I recommend it to you reading. Thirdly, there would have been no churches, no homes for the aged, no orphanages for the homeless, for homeless children, no such works of Christian charity, all done in the name of Jesus. You might say, "Wait a minute, Pastor, I'm not going there. You're telling me that if Christ never would have come, there'd be none of that?" Well, friends, let me just tell you that you have to remember that there were no such institutions in pagan countries at the time of Christ. The world can complain about the imperfections of Christianity all they want, but the facts still remain. None of these things existed before Christ, and the vast majority of them were started in the name of Christ. Even if they've gone astray, even if they've been perverted, even if they've been contaminated, they began in the name of Christ. A missionary who had returned from China about 1920 explained that when the crops in that country failed, the aged grandparents were driven from their homes that could not afford to care for their homes. And they were left to starve unless they could get to a mission station where they would be cared for as best the missionaries were able to provide care. I read an account of a pilot on an aircraft carrier in World War II who boasted about his contempt for religion. But one day, on a bombing mission in the South Pacific, his plane got lost from the carrier. They were low on fuel, and they knew that they would have to land on one of these islands that dotted the ocean, many of which were inhabited by cannibals. The pilot looked for a place to land. As they neared the island, the navigator called out, "We're all right. There's a church down there. I see a cross on a steeple." Later, when the pilot remembered how relieved he was at seeing a church building, he became a Christian believer. Virtually all of what we enjoy today, dear friends, in modern civilized culture comes from the influence of Christianity. Let me just give you a brief review. Let's think about slavery for an example. Let's think of children for an example. Education, universities, printing press, science, compassion, mercy, work ethic, free enterprise, literature, work, art. All of these things were greatly influenced in our world by the work of Christ and Christian church and Christian ministry. None of them would be the same today if Christ would never have come. So, beloved, we need to take time at this time of year, not only thanking Christ for what he has done for us, but considering what he has done for the world and what the world would be like if he had never come. Now, as we continue this thought of what would the world be like without Christ, let me mention a few of those specifics. Slavery. Although many committed Christians owned slaves throughout history, it was Christians who historians credit with being the primary force behind ending international slave trade. 2/3 of the members of the American Abolition Society in 1835 were Christian ministers. Children. In the ancient world, for example, in classical Rome and Greece, infanticide was not only legal, it was applauded. The killing a Roman was murder, but it was commonly held in Rome that killing one's children could be an act of beauty. Through a higher view of life, it was the early Christian church that ultimately brought an end to infanticide. The modern pro-life movement is largely made up of Christians. This pro-life view has been true from the very beginning of Christianity. How about education? From the beginning of Judaism, from which Christianity is derived, there was an emphasis on the written word. But the phenomenon of education of the masses has its roots, really, in the Protestant Reformation.